Hello everyone and welcome back to the video. I know it's been a while, but you know, whatever. Today I'm going to be reviewing this, the Sigma Contemporary Series 35mm f2 prime lens. Sigma makes this lens for both Sony's E mount and then Leica's L mount. It retails for $639, pretty much directly competing with Sony's 35mm 1.8 for their camera bodies, but it undercuts the price a little bit. It doesn't really compete with anything in the Leica L mount family yet. Panasonic Lumix has plans to release a 35 1.8, but they still say that sales are just scheduled. There's no real release date yet. And when it comes to Leica L mount bodies, there's really no other lens in this price range other than other Sigma contemporary lenses. So I decided to grab this lens for my Lumix S1R, which shares that Leica L mount. I wanted something smaller, other than the only other lens I have for the camera, which I'm using right now to film this video, the Lumix S Pro 24-70 2.8. It's a fantastic lens, but it's a behemoth. So throughout this video, as I'm talking about this lens, I will throw up some photos that I took with it, and then we'll get into the video aspect later. So to start off, let's talk about the form factor. The lens is small and compact, but I wouldn't call it light. It's constructed almost entirely of metal, but in my opinion, that's a good thing. It actually balances out my S1R pretty well, because the S1R is the biggest mirrorless camera out there, so it fits well on there. But I could see if you put this onto a Sony body, it might be a little front heavy. Another cool thing about this lens and all the lenses in Sigma's Contemporary series is that it has a physical aperture ring, which I really like. It's fun, you know. And then it also has a physical manual focus and autofocus knob, which even my expensive Lumix S Pro lens doesn't have. The only weird thing about the aperture ring on this lens is that it goes the opposite way of any other aperture ring I've used on other cameras. Mostly just cameras I shoot film with. But at the end of the day, that's not a huge deal. It's just a quirk. Sigma says that the entire lens isn't weather sealed, but there is weather sealing on the part that mounts over to your camera. And I actually, a couple weeks ago, used this thing in like direct rain, and it worked fine. There's no built-in stabilization for this lens. That might matter to you if you shoot a ton of video, but in my case, my camera has an in-body stabilizer, so it doesn't really matter to me. But if your camera doesn't have an in-body stabilizer, that's definitely something to consider. Because with no stabilization whatsoever and you're shooting handheld, there's going to be a lot of shake. The lens head on this thing is pretty massive, but it's still a compact solution if you are looking for a small prime lens for your Leica L mount camera. It looks a little different because even the lens hood is made out of metal, but I think it looks kind of cool. I actually accidentally bumped it into a mailbox the other day and it made like a really loud noise and it was kind of funny. So anyway, moving on from that, we can talk about the performance of this lens. When it comes to shooting photos, I can't really speak for the lens's autofocus performance on Sony camera bodies as I got the Leica version of it, but when it comes to my Lumix S1R, autofocus performance didn't seem too far off from what I was experiencing with my 24-70 2.8. The only thing that really stood out is when I was actually shooting photos, I could feel the motors inside the lens actually hunting for focus. I think it's just because it's a cheaper lens and a smaller lens, so you're gonna feel those mechanical operations more than you would on a higher end lens. But at the end of the day, like, does that really matter? Not really. The bokeh, or depth of field, is very nice at f2 on this lens. It's not going to be insane like a 1.4 or even a 1.2, but it's going to be definitely enough to give you a nice aesthetic depth of field for portrait photography or anything else you want depth of field for. Your trade-off between getting this lens and something like Sigma's 35mm f1.2 lens is obviously going to be the size, and then I've also heard that the 35 1.2 has some pretty bad autofocus hunting issues. So when it comes to photo quality, I've honestly really enjoyed how sharp this lens can be. A lot of the time in the past when I used third-party lenses, meaning like a different manufacturer, Sigma, Tamron, Rokinon, brands like that. A lot of the time when I use those, I would experience at least some loss of quality. Things like bland colors coming out of the camera, vignetting, or blurring on the edges, or weird bokeh. But I haven't come across this issue with this lens yet. And to be honest, I was pretty surprised because that's what I was expecting. Because from what I understand is that these manufacturers will design the lens up to the mount and then just kind of stick the correct mount adhering to the camera body, and that's it. And that can cause some issues on the edges of photos and things like that. But again, I haven't seen anything. Now, that could just be a bias because I used to shoot Sony all the time, and Sony's mount is a little iffy for manufacturers, so maybe it just happens more on Sony cameras. But on my Lumix with the Leica L mount, I'm not seeing it. Again, I usually recommend sticking with your manufacturer's lenses for your camera. Like, stick with Canon for Canon, Sony for Sony, and don't like waste money on some other cheaper brand. But again, in my situation with my camera, there's not many options unless I want to pay thousands of dollars for a Leica brand prime lens, and I'm not going to do that. But I'd be happy to try one out if there's a Leica sponsor watching this video right now. So how's it look for video? Well, I'll throw it on right here. So here's what my setup looks like at a 35mm focal length. I have my 2 lights, my microphone, and obviously my camera over there. This obviously isn't an optimal shooting scenario, but I didn't feel like moving everything around. But this gives you an idea of, comparing my last lens, my higher end, $2,200 Lumix S Pro lens looks like to this Sigma 35mm f2 lens. Honestly, from looking at my live monitor over here, not a lot of complaints. It's focused on me just fine. If I move over here, is it gonna catch me? Is it gonna focus? Yep, there it goes. Is it gonna focus? Yeah, it just did. So it seems to be finding focus like reasonably fast. So yeah, here you go. If you're trying to film videos like I'm filming right now, you talking in front of a camera in a little, area, I'd probably get a tighter lens than this, like a 50mm or an 85. But for sake of example, here we are. Now anyway, let's get to some B-roll shots I did with this lens on my Lumix S1R. So when I was outside shooting with this lens, I experienced a little trouble while trying to film myself, like walking in and out of frame and then having the camera follow me. And this could very well just be my camera, because Lumix's autofocus uses contrast-based autofocus points, and the system is slower than most of the competition. I think this probably would not have happened on a newer Sony camera. It could be a multitude of things, but when I was outside and I had the facial tracking on, it just wasn't really catching on the way I'd hoped. And take that as you will, but it seems to be working just fine right here inside. So what's my final verdict on this lens? Well, I'm impressed with this lens for photography. I think it's a great walk-around lens, especially if you have one of the bigger Lumix cameras. Photo quality doesn't suffer, colors don't suffer from what I can tell. I think it's worth the price tag, especially if you have a L-mount camera and you don't want to spend thousands of dollars on a Leica lens or spend $2,000 on the 50mm 1.4 that Lumix offers that's just as big as my Lumix S Pro over here. So I think it's worth it in that regard. For video, I had a little trouble with it, like I mentioned, trying to shoot it outside, but for inside shooting, it seemed completely fine. It kind of depends what video you're shooting. If you're doing like cinematic stuff or maybe scenes or things like that, you're probably going to manually set your focus anyway. In those terms, it's probably fine. And again, if you're shooting on a Sony camera, you'll probably have a lot better luck with the autofocus than I did. There are a lot more choices around this price range for Sony's camera body. I even have a very similar lens. I have a 35mm f2.8 for my Sony camera. It's a Zeiss lens, and I think it's really, really good. And it was a little more expensive than this when it first came out. It was around $800, and I believe the Sony 35 1.8 that replaced it is around the same. Honestly, at this price range, if you're shooting on a Sony camera, I probably would just go with the Sony lens. It's made for that mount. It's made by Sony. It's probably just going to be that much better. I think in most cases, you should still stick with a proprietary lens, depending on your camera manufacturer. But this, if you want to save the money, I don't think it's a bad option at all. And I do, honestly, if I compare the build quality to like Sony's 35 1.8, this does feel better built because it is all metal and it has that aperture ring, but I do fear that it might suffer in autofocus performance just because of the mount being adapted over. I'm ultimately very happy with this lens, and I'm looking forward to using it more in the future when I go traveling and things like that, and I don't want to take my giant 24-70 S Pro 2.8 lens with me. So anyway, thank you guys for watching. Let me know what you thought in the comments. Let me know what lenses you're looking forward to getting, or don't, whatever. Anyway, I'll see you next time. Bye.